everyone, I'm Daniel Kassoon and manager with HR Consulting Services, and we're here at the CPHR BC conference. Excited to be here today because we're going to be talking about the future of HR and how leadership intersects with that and where we need to go. And I'm pleased to have beside me Sandra Mcdowell. Sandra, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and the many accomplishments that you have, and we'll move into it from there.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Daniel, and MNP. It's so great to be here talking about my favorite subject, which is leadership. So my background, I have been an executive in the credit union system for over 20 years. I've also done a lot of speaking, as well as wrote a book and founded an online leadership academy.
That's fantastic. We have the book right here. It's Your Mother Was Right, 15 Unexpected Lessons About Leadership and the Brain. And we'll get into this a little bit later on because it's fantastic and I'm working my way through it and it's a great read. So with that, and as we go through and just have our conversation today, I really wanted to start with, okay, we hear a lot about where HR is going and workplaces being automated and everyone's stressed to the max. Where do you see HR going and how leadership fits into that?
That's a great question. I think that the future of HR is really around putting the human back into human resources. And I think that's been a little bit lost over time as we've focused on processes and practices around compensation and benefits. And as we look to the human and some of the things you mentioned about the things that aren't working, how do we create workspaces that are conducive for people to work? When we look back, we see that human resources has been based on, at one point, muscle and the ability to do the job, and maybe in the last decade, the brains. And I really think the future of HR is in the heart and connecting people with their purpose and their passion.
So in thinking about that then, and some of the pieces we talked about, at MNP we hear a lot about technology taking over the workplace. And so putting the human back into that, how do you get there just with all the tech overload I find that's going on?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that has complicated leadership because as we have become more geographically dispersed, more tech savvy, more tech dependent, we've taken the human even more so out of the work, which isn't actually good for the brain, which is, if you've been reading in the book, we talk about the importance of connection and social connection and how we're biologically, neurologically hardwired for human connection. And so when we are missing out on that, we start to withdraw. And so if I think for the future of technology is to recognize that, it is important, it's absolutely necessary for our work and for our work in HR, but how do we make sure that we're building teams and trust and collaboration behind the tools?
How do you foresee building leadership capacity to get us to that future state?
It's important, first of all and foremost, for people to have a model of leadership, leading by example. I think leaders shape culture, and any culture is defined by the worst behavior that a leader will tolerate. So if we're not modeling good leadership practices, then the chances of building future leadership capacity is pretty minimal. So I think that's one of my passions, is to really create awareness around the importance of understanding how to lead with the brain in mind so that we can start to understand the human and putting it back into the workplace. I think it's really interesting around millennials and how they're going to make up they are making up such a large part of our workplace and will continue to do more so. There was a recent study put out by CBC this week actually talking about how millennials are sort of lacking that purpose, looking for that connection. And over 50% of them would forego a raise of $10,000 just to have meaningful work. I mean, that is significant. So when you look at human resources, what's our job? Our job is to step into this space to create that purpose and passion for employees, but also the physical and mental well-being that goes along with that.
At MNP we see a lot of generational uniqueness in organizations where folks are trying to tailor to each generation, whether it be boomers, Gen X, getting into millennials and Gen Y down the road. So as you go through and a leader in this space, do you go through and give suggestions tailoring to each one of those groups, or do you look at this holistically and where we can go from a leadership standpoint?
I think it's meeting people where they're at. I don't think it's really hard to typecast millennials as a certain way or Gen X. I think it's recognizing what someone needs, and that comes from connection and understanding what's important to you, what do you value. As a Gen Xer, we always sort of laugh because they say millennials, they want so much, they want flexibility, they want time off. Well, we want it too. We just maybe didn't have the courage or the strength in numbers to demand it. So I think that everybody wants the things that often millennials have the strong voice for, and that's just the future of the way it is. They just happen to be on the edge of requesting it.
Right, yeah, and then that courage to step up and voice, what is a meaningful workplace to me, right, if we come back to meaningfulness.
That's right.
So then the tough task for our leaders then is, how do we equip them with tools to lead and go down this route? So, with your executive role, and the speaking that you do, the clients you interact with, and with the leadership courses that you teach, how do you equip leaders with tools to go through and be able to accomplish this large feat?
Yeah. One of the things that people that work with me, I say often is that leadership isn't for the faint of heart.
Right.
And really, I believe that leadership is action, not position. So it's not necessarily based on a title or a designated position of authority, but it's how we show up and help people move forward. So when I work with leaders, with organizations, with those in the programs that I facilitate, it's about showing up every day in a way that's going to help move people forward. So the very first step with working people for their personal leadership, whether it's a designated position authority or not, is, who are you? What's your essence? What's important to you? What are your values? Is this a fit? What are you going to stand up for? And then what I find, it's the language of leadership that supports that. Things like emotional intelligence, to understand emotional regulation, understanding the brain, which is so important, how to manage the negativity bias, how to strategies for motivation and influence, and how to handle change. I feel like knowledge is power, and that people, when they understand the concepts, can really help to leverage them for their own success.
So going through then and setting up that framework, it's like, how would you define then and take a look at, the essence of leadership and a good leader? What does that look like for you?
I think leadership, if you Google leadership, it's just an overwhelming amount of suggestions. There's so many different theories. The essence of leadership, I believe, is leading with heart and backbone. So really looking at the heart in terms of connection and fostering those connections that we need to engage and have trust and belief and hope. And then making sure that we are leading in a way that, for backbone, having courageous conversations, dealing with difficult issues, holding people accountable, and creating accountable situations. And so it's that interplay of heart and backbone.
Right, and I think that's a fantastic point, just to jump in on that, especially in the profession of HR, where I find the pendulum can swing either one of two ways instead of staying in the middle, where it's very empathetic or very hardline, almost like policing, right? And I don't, with yourself in your executive role, how do you manage that internally and with your teams, right, as you're going through and managing that expectation of HR? Yeah,
that's another great point. This heart and backbone continuum. I think if you ask somebody, this is usually how I lead into it from an executive coach perspective, is tell me your strengths. And somebody will tell me their strengths, and it'll usually fall something heartfelt about how they have such a big heart, or they care and all that, or the opposite, as you said, I'm very good at setting goals and holding people accountable. And so I say, well, tell me where that's working for you. And so then they'll go down that path, and so tell me where it's not. And so what we find is something I learned early on, is a strength overplayed can become a weakness. So when we overplay our strengths, it becomes something that works against us, and finding our way back to balance. And so I think authentically, if we look at the family unit itself is a great example of leading with heart and backbone. As parents, as siblings, as a family unit, we know that we need to be empathetic and heartfelt to connect, but we also know that we have to have those tough conversations. So I think when we look in a corporate world, sometimes we do find that balance is off, and I believe it comes from authenticity, that we can find our place, a way back to see that balance.
I wanted to get into one more point of neuro leadership and how that fits into all this, because we have been talking about heart, backbone, and starting the influences of the leadership and the brain and how those come together. So what is neuro leadership and how is that coming into play in our workforces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my studies, or my journey of learning, has gone through learning about leadership and coaching, and then the reality that it's not necessarily always working. If you look at the stats around employee engagement, a shocking number of people worldwide are disengaged. So something from a leadership perspective, from a people perspective, from a brain perspective is not working. So that led me into the study of the brain and neuroscience. And there's a emerging discipline called neuroleadership, which really looks at the discipline of leadership as it applies to the brain, quite simply. So what's working and what's not working in terms of the effective leadership. And there's a lot of things that aren't working. The amount of stress and the implications of cortisol on the brain, as well as our ability to focus, is deteriorating at a rapid rate. And just the overall well-being, the importance of sleep and exercise and activity.
Right. Not to oversimplify things, but an element of it would be self-care.
Yeah.
Right, in terms of just a healthy activity, healthy brain functioning, and then potentially more healthy leadership models or capacity that you have going on there.
Yeah, which is that's what led me to the title of the book, Your Mother is Right, because quite frankly, we know all of this stuff, and we shouldn't need neuroscience and data and research to back up things that we know. We need to get our sleep, we need to eat right, we need to exercise, we need to be nice because it opens up for the possibility of engagement. We need to think positive. We need to count to 10, manage our emotions. So that was really, it's to simplify what you just said, is that we know this stuff, and we just have to listen to what's good for our brain, and then we can show up in a way that's effective for leadership.
Right. As a mentor, as a professional in this field, and an expert around leadership, what are one or two snippets, as you would summarize for folks? How would you want them to start their leadership journey, and what bit of advice could you give folks going down that path as they transform, into the future of what this profession could be?
From an HR perspective, I think HR professionals need to really start with themselves, as we talked about, that self-awareness, to understand their own values. From there, they can understand their convictions, to know what they need to create, the kind of human conditions that we want to create for employee experience, and also know what we want to be vigilant about, to be able to protect employees from, to be able to set them up for their best. So from a human resource perspective, it's not for somebody else. It's not the programs you're going to set up for somebody else. It's what you need to start with first.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, that gets me to the end of my question.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much for
Thank
being
you
here
so
today
much.
and sharing, everything around leadership and where it's going, and introducing us to neuro leadership, which I think is fascinating and exciting as I've worked through it.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to talking with you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug.
Thank
Thank you for having me.
Take care.